The sun had barely set over Los Angeles, but the street in front of the massive movie theater was already glowing. It wasn't the glow of the moon or the streetlights. It was the blinding, white-hot flash of hundreds of cameras. The premiere of John Wick wasn't just a movie showing. It was an event. The entire block was shut down. Red carpet, thick and plush, rolled out like a river of crimson, cutting through the concrete. Barriers lined the streets, holding back thousands of fans who had been waiting there all day, just hoping for a single glimpse of the man of the hour inside a sleek black SUV. That was just inching toward the drop-off zone. Keanu Reeves sat in the back seat. He was adjusting his cufflinks, taking a deep breath. To anyone watching, he looked calm. He looked like a movie star ready to work. But if you could look closer, past the handsome face and the perfectly tailored suit, you would see a man who was carrying a heavy weight on his shoulders. This wasn't just another action movie for him. It wasn't just about guns or fighting or looking cool on screen. This movie was about a dog. And specifically, it was about a man who loses everything and finds his only remaining comfort in a puppy. Anyone who knew Keanu's real life knew that this storyline hit him like a punch to the chest. He wasn't acting the part of a grieving man who loved his dog. In many ways, he was reliving it. The car finally came to a stop. The driver stepped out and opened the door. The noise outside was instant. It was a roar, a wall of sound made up of screams and cheers. Keanu stepped out onto the pavement. The flashes from the cameras were so bright and so fast that they looked like constant lightning striking in the middle of the night. He blinked a few times, adjusting his eyes, and then he put on his smile. It was his shield. It was the face he showed the world when he didn't want people to see what he was really feeling. He walked over to the fans first. He always did. He didn't just wave from a distance like some stars did. He went right up to the barricades. He shook hands. He signed autographs. He looked people in the eye. The crowd went wild. They chanted his name. They loved him not just because he was Neo or John Wick, but because he was Keanu. He was the guy who waited in line like everyone else, the guy who rode the subway, the guy who treated everyone with respect. But as he shook hands and signed posters, his mind was drifting. The noise of the crowd seemed to fade into the background, replaced by his own thoughts. He thought about the years leading up to this night. He had faced some of the hardest moments a person can face. He had lost the woman he loved. He had lost a child. And through all that darkness, the only light that never truly went out for him came from his dogs. They were the ones who greeted him at the door when he came home to an empty house. They were the ones who sat by his side when he didn't have the energy to speak. Now, here he was about to sit in a theater and watch a movie about that exact bond. He was happy about the film. He knew it was good work. But there was a tightness in his chest. It felt like a mix of anxiety and sadness. It was the feeling of opening an old wound you thought was healed. He turned away from the fans and started walking down the red carpet toward the interview line. This was the gauntlet. Stop, smile, answer the same question 10 times, stop, smile again. Entertainment reporters were holding microphones out like weapons, waiting for a soundbite. Keanu, over here, how does it feel to be back? Keanu, tell us about the training. Keanu, is it true you did all your own stunts? He answered them politely. It feels great, he said with a nod. The training was intense, but worth it. He was smooth, professional. But underneath the suit, he felt exposed. He felt the pressure of the comeback. It had been a while since he had a massive hit like this. People were watching to see if he still had that spark. He wanted to prove he could still do it, not for the fame, but because he loved making movies that made people feel something, but mostly he just wanted to get inside. The noise, the lights, the expectations, it was all too much. He felt a strange urge to just be alone, or better yet, to be with his dog, a small scruffy rescue he had left back at the hotel. That dog was his reality. This red carpet? This was the dream, and sometimes dreams felt very lonely. As he got closer to the entrance of the theater, the crowd seemed to press in tighter. The energy was intense. He could feel the vibrations of the bass from the music playing nearby. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the cool night air, trying to steady his racing heart. He looked up at the massive poster of himself holding a puppy. He saw the irony of it. He was playing the toughest assassin in the world, a man who kills without hesitation, but the story wasn't about the killing. It was about how that one little animal gave him a reason to live. Keanu knew that feeling better than anyone. He touched his pocket where he kept a small treat for his own dog, a habit he had developed. It was grounding. He finally reached the end of the carpet. The bright lights were behind him now, and the dark mouth of the theater entrance was in front of him. He stopped for one last photo, his hand resting on the velvet rope. He looked out at the sea of faces one last time. They were screaming his name, cheering for a character they hadn't even seen yet. They wanted the action. They wanted the violence. They wanted the show, but Keanu's mind was quiet. He forced one last, genuine smile for the crowd. A smile that didn't quite reach his eyes this time, and turned toward the door. He was stepping out of the real world and into the world of John Wick, but the heavy feeling in his stomach didn't go away. It was going to be a long night. The biggest night of his professional life in years, and all he could think about was how much he missed the quiet, simple joy of just being a normal guy with his best friend. He walked through the doors, and the chaotic noise of the outside world was suddenly cut off, replaced by the muffled, sophisticated chatter of the VIP lobby. He straightened his tie, put his game face back on, and prepared to face the evening. Little did he know the night was about to take a turn that no scriptwriter could have ever predicted. Once he stepped through the heavy velvet doors of the theater, the world changed completely. Outside, it was chaos and screaming fans, but inside, everything was polished, quiet, and smelled of expensive perfume and popcorn. The air was cool, blasted by air conditioning that felt almost too cold against his skin. Keanu walked into the main lobby, and it was like stepping into a different planet. People were standing in small circles, holding champagne flutes, talking in low, serious voices about money and business. They all looked perfect. The men were in tuxedos, and the women were in gowns that probably cost more than most people's cars. To anyone else, this looked like the peak of success. It looked like the place everyone wanted to be. But for Keanu, it felt like walking through a museum filled with beautiful things he couldn't quite touch. He shook a few hands. He nodded at a producer who was talking loudly about the box office predictions. He smiled at a few actors he had worked with in the past. He said all the right things. "Great to see you. Looking forward to it. Thanks for coming." But his heart wasn't in the conversation. His feet felt itchy, like he wanted to move, to run, to get away from the fake politeness that filled the room. What nobody in that crowded lobby knew was that Keanu had a secret. He wasn't just there for the movie. He was there because he couldn't bear to be too far away from the one thing that kept him sane. Tucked away in a small, quiet room backstage, a room usually used for storage or for actors to cry in before a big scene, was his dog. It was a small, scruffy terrier mix he had rescued. The dog wasn't a purebred with papers. He wasn't a show dog. He was just a goofy, loving little animal that Keanu had found during a time when everything in his life felt gray. Keanu stood near the edge of the lobby, sipping a glass of water he had grabbed from a passing tray. He watched the crowd. He saw people looking at him, whispering, pointing their phones. He felt the pressure building in his chest again. It was the feeling of being watched, of being expected to be on all the time. He felt like a vase that was about to crack. He needed to escape. He looked around for a valid excuse, but he didn't need one. He was Keanu Reeves. If he needed a moment, he was going to take it. He muttered a quick excuse to an assistant who was hovering nearby, something about needing to make a quick call before the film started, and he slipped away. He walked quickly down a long, dimly lit hallway away from the noise. The further he got from the lobby, the lighter his steps felt. The sound of clinking glasses and fake laughter faded away until it was just a dull hum in the distance. He turned a corner and opened a plain white door that led to the backstage area. As soon as the door clicked shut, he felt his shoulders drop. The tension left his body. He walked into the small green room. There was a small table, a couple of chairs, and a dog bed in the corner. And sitting on that bed, ears perking up at the sound of the door, was his dog. The little dog didn't see a movie star. He didn't see John Wick, he just saw his person. The dog let out a happy bark and scrambled up, his tail wagging so hard his whole body shook. Keanu didn't care about his tuxedo. He didn't care if his pants got wrinkled. He crouched down on the floor right there. The dog rushed over and climbed into his lap, licking his chin and nudging his nose against Keanu's neck. For the first time all night, Keanu's smile was real. It wasn't for the cameras. It was small and tired, but it reached his eyes. He buried his face in the dog's fur, taking a deep breath. The smell of the dog earthy and real grounded him instantly. This was what mattered. This was real. The red carpet was a fantasy. The movie was a job. But this little creature in his arms was life. It was love. "Hey, buddy," Keanu whispered, scratching the dog behind the ears. "You miss me?" "It's loud out there." The dog let out a small whine and curled up tighter against him. Keanu sat there on the floor for a long time. He could hear the muffled sounds of the party continuing without him. He knew people were probably wondering where he was. He knew he should probably be out there networking and shaking hands. But he couldn't make himself move. He just sat there, petting the soft fur, feeling the steady rhythm of the dog's heartbeat against his chest. It was the only thing that felt steady in a world that was spinning too fast. He thought about the movie again. John Wick. The story of a man who loses everything. Keanu knew that feeling of emptiness too well. He looked down at the dog in his lap and felt a wave of protective love so strong it made his throat tight. He understood the character perfectly. If anything happened to this little guy, Keanu knew he would burn the world down too, just like in the script. It wasn't just acting. It was truth, eventually. He heard a faint chime over the intercom system, a signal that the movie was going to start in 10 minutes and everyone needed to take their seats. Reality was calling him back. He let out a long sigh and kissed the dog on the top of the head. "I have to go now," he said softly. "Be good, I'll be back soon." He stood up, smoothing down his suit. The dog watched him with big, soulful eyes, tilting his head to the side. Keanu gave the handler, a young woman sitting in the corner reading a book, a thankful nod. "Take good care of him," he said. She smiled and promised she would. Keanu took one last look at the dog, who had settled back into his bed, and then turned to leave, walking back down the hallway toward the bright lights of the theater. Felt much harder than leaving them had been. The peace he had found in the room evaporated with every step he took toward the lobby. By the time he pushed through the doors, the mask was back on. He was the movie star again. He walked into the theater auditorium. It was massive. The seats were plush red velvet and the screen was enormous. People were filing in, finding their seats, buzzing with excitement. Keanu moved toward the front row. People reached out to touch his shoulder as he passed, whispering congratulations. He nodded, his face a blank slate of polite concentration. He found his seat and sat down. The lights began to dim slowly. The chatter in the room died down. The theater went dark, save for the glow of the exit signs. Keanu stared straight ahead at the giant screen, but his mind was still in that small room backstage. He felt a pang of guilt, leaving the dog alone back there. He felt a sudden urge to just get up and leave, to take the dog and go home, where they could just lie on the couch and order pizza. The orchestra began to play the opening score. The music was low and ominous, vibrating through the floor. It was the sound of the movie starting. It was the sound of his career being reborn. But as the logo flashed on the screen, all Keanu could think about was how much he wished he could have smuggled the dog into the theater in his jacket. He looked around at the dark silhouettes of the audience, waiting to be entertained. He felt incredibly lonely. He adjusted his cuffs and tried to focus. This was it. The moment everyone had been waiting for. But just as the first scene faded in from black, a movement near the back of the theater caught his eye. A door had opened. A sliver of light from the hallway cut through the darkness. And then a small shadow darted across the floor. Keanu squinted, his heart skipping a beat. He knew that shape. He knew that run. The piece he had left backstage was coming to find him. The giant screen in front of the theater flickered to life, bathing the dark room in a cold, blue light. The heavy, dramatic music of the John Wick score began to swell, vibrating through the floorboards and rattling the cup holders in the armrests. Around Keanu, the audience went completely silent. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The critics, the fans, the Hollywood executives, they were all leaning forward in their seats, ready to judge the movie, ready to see if the star of the 90s could still command the screen. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, but Keanu wasn't watching the screen. His eyes were fixed on a small beam of light that had just cut across the back row of the theater. It started as a small creak, the sound of the heavy exit door opening against the pressure of the hallway. It was a faint sound, barely audible over the deep bass of the movie's opening notes, but to Keanu it was louder than a gunshot. He turned his head slightly, squinting into the darkness. The light from the hallway spilled in, silhouetting a small, four-legged figure. The figure slipped through the crack in the door, and then the door clicked shut, plunging the room back into darkness. Save for the glow of the movie. At first, nobody else noticed. They were too busy watching the opening titles. But then, a sound echoed through the quiet theater. Click, click, click. It was the distinctive sound of claws on a concrete floor, quickly changing to the muffled thud of paws on thick carpet. Keanu's heart jumped. He knew that rhythm. He knew that gait. He stopped breathing for a second, his focus entirely torn away from the millions of dollars worth of action playing out on the silver screen. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, but he stayed still. He didn't want to make a scene. He didn't want to scare the intruder away. The little dog, the scruffy terrier he had left just minutes ago, was on a mission. He wasn't sniffing around for popcorn or looking for a friendly stranger to pet him. He had one goal, and that was to find the person he loved most in the world. The dog trotted down the slight incline of the aisle, his head held high, sniffing the air. The theater smelled like butter, expensive leather, and hundreds of different perfumes, but somewhere in that mix, he caught the scent he was looking for. A woman in the fourth row noticed the movement first. She jumped slightly, knocking her bag over. "Oh," she gasped, loud enough for the people around her to hear. People started to turn. Heads shifted away from the screen. Is that a dog?" Someone whispered loudly. "She!" Someone else hissed. "The movie!" But the whispering spread like a wave. It moved from the back of the theater toward the front, rippling through the rows of seats. The security guards who were standing near the walls with their arms crossed suddenly realized what was happening. One of them, a tall man with a flashlight, started to move briskly up the aisle. He looked stressed. This was a premiere. Thousands of dollars had been spent on security. A loose dog was a disaster. Keanu saw the guard moving. He saw the panic in the guard's body language. The dog, unaware of the trouble he was causing, just kept walking. He weaved through the forest of legs, dodging shoes and purses with an impressive agility. He didn't care about the movie. He didn't care about the flashing lights of the film reflecting off the seats. He just kept moving forward, guided by a scent and an instinct that was stronger than any training. The guard was getting closer. He was reaching out, probably to grab the dog by the collar and carry him out. Keanu felt a sudden protective instinct flare up in his chest. He couldn't let the guard drag the dog out like a nuisance. He sat up straighter, turning his body fully toward the aisle. He was ready to stand up, ready to call out, ready to stop the movie if he had to. But he didn't have to dot. Just as the guard's hand was inches away, the dog seemed to sense the energy ahead. He picked up his pace, breaking into a clumsy trot. He dodged the guard's hand, slipped between a pair of knees in the front row, and scrambled toward the absolute center of the theater. There, sitting in the most expensive seat in the house, was his person. The dog didn't hesitate. He didn't bark. He didn't jump on the strangers next to him. He simply put his front paws up on the armrest and looked at Keanu with pure, unconditional adoration. His tail was wagging so hard it was thumping against the empty seat next to him. For a second, time seemed to stop. The movie was still playing, explosions and car chase noises filling the room, but the little bubble around Keanu was completely quiet. He looked down at the little, scruffy face staring up at him. The dog's tongue was lolling out to the side, and his eyes were bright. He had escaped the green room. He had dodged the security. He had navigated a dark, crowded room just to be here. Keanu didn't care about the movie anymore. He didn't care about the hundreds of eyes that were now fixed on him instead of the screen. He didn't care that he was breaking the strict rules of a film premiere. He reached down and scooped the dog up in one smooth motion. Lifting him onto his lap, the moment the dog was in his arms, he melted. He buried his face in the dog's neck, inhaling that familiar, comforting smell. He felt the warm weight of the animal against his chest, grounding him instantly. The anxiety, the pressure, the feeling of being a fake it all vanished. In a room full of people paid to pretend to be something they weren't. This was the only real thing. The security guard stopped in his tracks, confused. He looked at Keanu, then at the dog, then back at Keanu. He slowly lowered his hand, realizing that this wasn't a security breach. This was a reunion. The people around them stopped whispering. They stopped watching the movie. They were watching the man who played the ultimate killer on screen, cradling a tiny, scruffy rescue dog like it was a precious jewel. Keanu looked up, his eyes wet and shining. He glanced at the people sitting next to him, an apologetic look on his face, but they weren't annoyed. They were smiling. A woman in the row behind him let out a quiet, happy sigh. Even the toughest-looking critics in the room had soft expressions on their faces. The movie on the screen roared with the sound of a car engine, but the real drama was over. The unforgettable moment had happened. It wasn't a fight scene. It wasn't a plot twist. It was just a dog refusing to let his best friend face a big night alone. Keanu scratched the dog behind the ears, whispering words that only the dog could hear, finally settling in to watch the movie, but now he wasn't lonely anymore. The theater was completely dark, except for the flickering light coming from the massive screen. On the movie, cars were screeching and tires were smoking, filling the room with a chaotic, noisy energy. But down in the front row, in the shadows of the VIP section, a completely different scene was playing out. It was quiet and intimate, a tiny bubble of peace in the middle of the storm. Keanu had the dog firmly in his arms now. The little animal, realizing he had successfully completed his mission, stopped squirming. He seemed to understand that he was safe. He curled up into a ball, tucking his nose under his tail, making himself as small as possible so he would fit perfectly on his owner's lap. He was warm and heavy, a solid weight of comfort against Keanu's chest. Keanu leaned back in his plush seat, his hand resting gently on the dog's back. He could feel the heartbeat thumping steadily against his ribs. A rhythm that was much slower and calmer than the pounding bass of the movie soundtrack. For a moment, Keanu just sat there, letting the reality of the situation wash over him. He looked down at his lap. The dog's scruffy fur was catching the light from the screen, turning gold and silver with every flash of the movie. It was such a stark contrast. On the screen above his head, a version of himself was running, jumping, and fighting. It was a character made of steel and anger, a man seeking revenge. But in reality, the man sitting in the chair was just a human being, soft and vulnerable, finding his only true comfort in a small, rescued creature. The absurdity of it suddenly hit him. Here he was, at one of the most prestigious premieres of his career, surrounded by the most powerful people in Hollywood, and he had basically crashed his own party with his dog. He thought about how serious everyone was acting. He thought about the security guards, the red carpet, the intense interviews. And then he looked at the little ball of fur sleeping on his tuxedo. A chuckle started deep in his chest. It wasn't a fake laugh or a polite laugh. It was a real, genuine sound that he tried to suppress at first, putting a hand over his mouth. But it was too strong. It bubbled up, escaping through his fingers. Soon his shoulders were shaking, and he was letting out a hearty, belly-deep laugh. It was the kind of laugh you let out when you are with your best friend on a Tuesday night. Not the kind of laugh you let out at a formal movie premiere. The sound of his laugh was surprising. It cut through the deep rumble of the movie's explosions. It was warm and infectious. It rang out in the theater, clearer than any sound effect. The people sitting around him reacted instantly. Heads turned away from the screen. The woman in the sequin dress who had looked annoyed when the dog ran past was now smiling. A man a few rows up who had been checking his phone looked back to see what was so funny. When they saw Keanu Reeves sitting there, clutching his dog and laughing with pure joy, the tension in the room evaporated. It was like a spell had been broken. Everyone stopped pretending to be cool, detached movie critics. They became human beings who were witnessing something incredibly sweet. The fourth wall that usually exists between a movie star and the audience completely dissolved. You could feel the atmosphere shift. It went from stiff and formal to warm and fuzzy. People started whispering to each other, not with gossip, but with affection. "Look at that," someone whispered. "That is adorable." "I can't believe he just did that," another person murmured. Even the security guards, who had been so tense a minute ago, relaxed. The tall guard who had tried to catch the dog was standing near the wall now, his arms uncrossed, watching Keanu with a grin on his face. You could tell he was thinking, well, you can't really argue with that. The irony was beautiful. The movie John Wick is famous for being violent and gritty, but the core of the story is love, the love of a man for his dog. And here, in real life, the actor playing that role was showing the world exactly what that love looked like. He wasn't acting. He wasn't following a script. He was just a guy who loved his dog. And he didn't care if the whole world saw it. Keanu seemed to sense the change in the room. He looked up, still smiling, and made eye contact with a few people around him. He didn't look like a celebrity who was bothered by the attention. He looked like a guy sharing a private joke with a few hundred friends. He gave a little shrug, as if to say, "What can you do? He loves me." The dog, hearing his owner laugh, lifted his head and let out a small, sleepy bark. It was a tiny sound, a sharp yip, that made everyone laugh along with Keanu. The dog looked around, blinking at the darkness, clearly confused by why everyone was staring at him, but happy with the positive energy. He licked Keanu's hand, which only made Keanu laugh harder. The movie continued to play behind him. On screen, the action was reaching its climax. There was probably a big car chase or a fight scene happening. But nobody in the front few rows was paying attention to the movie anymore. They were watching Keanu. They were watching him stroke the dog's head. They were watching him lean down and whisper something into the dog's ear. It was a scene of total, unadulterated contentment. In that moment, Keanu wasn't the elusive action star. He wasn't the sad figure the tabloids liked to write about. He was just a man in a dark room, finding joy in the simplest of connections. The audience realized that they weren't just watching a movie about a hero. They were sitting next to a real-life hero, someone who found his strength in kindness. The lights on the screen flickered, changing the colors on Keanu's face from blue to red to white. But his expression remained the same, soft, open, and happy. He scratched the dog behind the ears one last time, settling in properly. He turned his eyes back to the screen, but his hand never stopped moving, gently petting the dog in a slow, rhythmic motion. The dog sighed a deep, heavy sigh of contentment and closed his eyes again. The room felt different now. It felt warmer. It felt safer. The audience stopped checking their watches. They stopped thinking about what they were going to write in their reviews. They just sat there, enjoying the movie, but more importantly, enjoying the feeling of being part of a moment that was undeniably, wonderfully human. The biggest star in the room had just brought the whole theater down to earth, and everyone was better for it. The movie finally ended. The dramatic music swelled to a loud crescendo, and the screen faded to black for the last time. The theater lights slowly began to rise, flickering on like a gentle sunrise, chasing away the shadows. Usually, at this point in a premiere, there is a moment of silence followed by polite, rehearsed applause. People are usually thinking about the traffic or the after-party or what they are going to write in their reviews. They stretch their legs and check their phones, but this night was different. Before the credits even finished rolling, the sound that filled the room wasn't just clapping. It was a collective sound of joy, a warm, rolling wave of happiness that started from the front and swept all the way to the back. The applause was genuine and loud, but it wasn't just for the fight scenes or the special effects. It was for the feeling they had all just shared. As the lights got brighter, revealing the rows of faces, Keanu stood up. He was still holding the dog. The little terrier woke up from his nap, blinking his eyes against the bright lights and looking around, confused by the sudden noise. He let out a tiny yawn, stretching his front paws out against Keanu's jacket. The sight of the dog waking up in the middle of a standing ovation was perfect. It was like a punchline to a joke that life had just told the entire room. Keanu didn't immediately bow or wave like a typical movie star accepting praise. Instead, he just looked down at his dog and rubbed his head, a huge, affectionate grin plastered across his face. He looked tired, but it was a good kind of tired. The kind of tired you feel after a long day of playing outside with your best friend? The heavy anxiety he had carried in his chest when he first walked into the theater was completely gone. He felt lighter than air. The people in the audience were smiling at him, but not with the look of fans staring at a celebrity. They were smiling with the look of people who had just witnessed something private and beautiful. There was no wall between them anymore. The fancy clothes, the red carpet, the VIP status, it all felt fake now. The only real thing in the room was the bond between the man and the dog, the man who had been sitting next to him. A well-known producer reached over and patted the dog on the head. He didn't say anything about the movie. He just looked at Keanu and said, "Best co-star I've seen all year." Keanu laughed, that same deep, genuine laugh from earlier. "He steals every scene," he replied softly. People started to gather around him as he made his way toward the aisle. Usually, security would be pushing people back, creating a clear path for the star to leave untouched. But the guards stood back this time. They watched as people approached Keanu. They wanted to tell him they liked the movie. Sure, but mostly they wanted to talk about the dog. A woman in a beautiful gown reached out to scratch the dog's ear. "He made the night for me," she told Keanu sincerely. It was strange and wonderful. Here was one of the most famous actors in the world, promoting a movie about a ruthless killer. And the entire conversation had shifted to a small, scruffy rescue dog. The violence of the movie was forgotten. The box office numbers didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was that for 2 hours, a little bit of real love had interrupted a fake world. As Keanu walked slowly up the aisle toward the exit, the dog sat securely in his arms, looking around like a king surveying his kingdom. Keanu looked at the faces of the people he passed. He saw kindness. He saw warmth. He realized that he had been worried about nothing. He didn't need to pretend to be the tough guy. He didn't need to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. Just by being himself, just by loving his dog, he had given these people something better than a movie. He had given them a moment of pure humanity. Walking out of the theater was a completely different experience than walking in. When he had arrived a few hours ago, the noise outside had felt like an attack. The cameras had felt like weapons. The crowd had felt like a demanding ocean he had to swim through. Now, as he stepped out into the cool night air, the flashing cameras didn't bother him. He saw the photographers not as sharks, but just as people doing their jobs. He stopped on the sidewalk for a moment. The dog perked up, sniffing the night air, happy to be outside. Keanu shifted his weight, holding the dog a little tighter. A reporter yelled out, asking him about the movie's stunts. Another one asked about the box office expectations. Keanu looked at them, then down at his dog, and then back at the cameras. He didn't give a clever quote. He didn't give a Hollywood soundbite. "I'm just glad I had my date with me," he said simply, nodding to the dog in his arms. The photographers laughed. It was a friendly sound, not a mocking one. They snapped their photos, capturing the image that would be in every newspaper and website the next day. It wouldn't be a picture of him looking cool and mysterious. It would be a picture of him looking down at his dog with a look of total devotion. And that picture would become more famous than any movie poster. He reached his car. The driver was holding the door open. Keanu didn't rush. He took his time. He leaned down and set the dog gently onto the back seat. The dog immediately circled a few times and lay down on the leather, resting his head on his paws, exhausted from his big adventure. Keanu slid in next to him and closed the door. The noise of the premiere, the music, the people, The hype was suddenly cut off again, replaced by the quiet silence of the car. He let out a long, deep breath. It was a breath of relief. The car started to move, pulling away from the curb, leaving the bright lights of the theater behind in the distance. The city of Los Angeles stretched out before them, a sea of millions of people. It was easy to get lost in a city like that. It was easy to feel small. But tonight, Keanu didn't feel lost. He looked over at his dog, who was already asleep again, his little chest rising and falling softly. The dog had done something unforgettable tonight. He hadn't run onto a stage to accept an award. He hadn't given a speech. He had just done what dogs do. He loved his person unconditionally. And in doing so, he had turned a scary, high-pressure night into a beautiful memory. He had reminded everyone that no matter how big you get, no matter how famous you become, the simple act of caring for something else is the most important thing you can do. Keanu reached out and put his hand on the dog's back, feeling the warmth of his fur. He watched the city lights blur past the window, a small, peaceful smile on his face. He wasn't thinking about the critics or the money. He was just thinking about how lucky he was to have a best friend who would jump through hoops just to sit on his lap. "Good boy," he whispered into the quiet car. "You were the best part of the movie." The car drove off into the night, carrying the movie star and his dog away from the fake lights of the premiere and back toward real life. And it was exactly where they both belonged,